Can everybody hear me okay? All right. My name is Denis Webster. I did the research and wrote the book here that you see up on the screen behind me. It was about 2 years worth of research. This is actually a reprint. The original book was actually a self-pub book that I had done, and it sold out, so turned around and decided it would be better if it was published through a real publishing house, not just through me. So the difference between the last version and this version is I was able to get the Landmark Society to do the forward for me, Mike Bozak, I don't know if you know the name, and I added some additional photographs and a few more things to this particular version. But what fascinated me to want to write this, well, I dedicated the book to my mother, who worked in the Office of Mental Health as a psychiatric nurse, and she dedicated her life to this type of care, patient care. And of course, she worked at Brigham Building, and I used to go there to visit my mother once in a while. And this, of course, those who have seen Old Main, it draws you right in, you know. So always a lifetime fascination with the place. So I decided I wanted to try to write about it. So I did the best I could. It was about 2 years worth of research. There was no one place that had everything that's in this book. I had to get information from here, the Oneida County History Center. I found some stuff at the Utica Public Library, and a lot of stuff downstate. I went to the New York State Archives in the library, a lot of the photographs and some other things. So just kind of piecemealed. It's kind of like being a historical detective. Just grab a bunch of little pieces and put it all together, and then hopefully it's I did a good enough job, but there's just so much history. So I'll start out. This is the iconic look of the front of the building, for those who have never seen it. Opened in January 16th, 1843. And what you're looking at here is the Greek Doric columns and the front look of this. Largest Greek Doric columns in the United States, about 8 foot around, about 40, 50 foot height. And the reason that they designed the asylum this way was because they felt that the look and the grounds of the asylum should have like a utopian type look to it. They felt that that would be part of the patient care, would have a very beautiful looking, aesthetically pleasing place for people who had mental illness to go. Except back then, the name of the place was the New York State Lunatic Asylum. And keep in mind, over the hundreds of years, different terms come in and out. You know, at the time, the phrase lunatic had to do with people feeling that mental illness was from the phases of the moon, where lunatic, luna, comes from. And other terms over the years, things like moron, imbecile, even mental retardation. Words we don't use today, but at the time, they were proper medical terms to refer to patients. Now, this particular overhead shot was the original layout and blueprint of what they wanted to build. Originally, they only built the very front part, which still stands today, when it first opened in 1843. Then they added the wings later on. Then as the building has deteriorated, obviously they've torn down some of these wings, but the front is still there. But the interesting thing about the way they wanted to do this was the largest asylum at the time, only the second one in the United States. But what made Old Main different was this was the first time in the history of the United States that they were recognizing mental illness as a possible medical condition, that people could be cured. The interesting thing was when they designed Old Main, they wanted it to have that utopian experience. They felt that was part of it. They called it the cult of curability. And the way they designed this was the south wing. Can you see that good enough? Is that clear enough up there? It's behind me. The south wing was all women. The north wing was all the male patients. And what they would do is the center part would be where the administration would be, and then they would put the least insane closest to the offices, and as they went down the wing, more insane, if that makes sense, okay? The most severe patients at that time. And the interesting thing about Old Main is when it opened, the nurses, or they called them patrons and matrons, the people that gave the direct care, actually lived in that building for an entire year. They would sign a one-year contract and live on the campus, as well as the doctors and the superintendent. And the way that they heated this was with boilers, coal and wood. So not the best, considering there was a lot of wood in this structure. And there was a fire, which I'll talk about later on. But it was 550 foot across the front. And the Utica was actually the second location. Originally, it was going to be downstate, but then they decided they wanted it centrally located, and they purchased the land that sat on for $10,000. And the reason they picked Utica was because the close access to transit, railroad, and also the Erie Canal at the time. So, because remember, they were bringing patients in here from all over the state of New York. This asylum took in everybody at the time. And the interesting thing about it was, back then they used the terminology, they said that they wanted admission by force, not deception. Because there was instances where people didn't realize they were being committed to Old Main. They would just go for a ride, and next thing you know, they were pulling up on a horse-drawn wagon and being brought in there. And, but they would rather force somebody in there. And the thing that was unique at the time, too, was it didn't take much for you to be committed to here. It only needed like either a judge's signature or a sheriff to go to the county that you lived in New York State and say that this person needs to be committed. And this right here is this symbolic head, which is phrenology, which this is from that time period where this is where science started to come into the treatment of mental illness. This is where they showed like different parts of the brain they thought had different emotions. So it wasn't just the phases of the moon or people being possessed by the devil. This is where they started to look at different ways behind mental illness. And the interesting thing about Old Main is they had a mix of all kinds of patients. They would have senior citizens that had dementia or perhaps Alzheimer's at the time, but they didn't know what it was. Or they would have people that had Down syndrome, or they would have people that were blind or deaf, of all ages. They would just separate you men to women, and each room would have about a dozen patients. But also, what was really dangerous at the time was they would put people that were the mentally, criminally insane. So you had people that were like axe murderers and serial killers being placed in with everybody else. They quickly realized that wasn't a good idea. Right here, I've got a picture. This is the very first superintendent, Amariah Brigham, who actually he's buried in Forest Hill Cemetery here in Utica, not far from Roscoe Conkling. And pretty brilliant man, and he was, as the first superintendent, he wanted to put in place what was called moral treatment. And what moral treatment was based on a European model that Pinel had done in France. Okay, and that was where they looked at, mental health also could be improved with things like occupations, jobs, activities, things like that, instead of just chaining somebody to a floor or a wall, or having them just sitting and not doing anything. Occupations helped their mental health. And Brigham did a lot of really fascinating, innovative things. Like he brought a print shop into Old Main, where the American Journal of Insanity started in the 1840s, and which is in still publication today. It's the longest running medical journal in the world, and it's called the American Journal of Psychiatry now. So he started it. All the research was done, and it was printed and sold and distributed out of Old Main right here in Utica. And has anybody ever seen this before? This is the Utica crib. Okay, this was an invention by Dr. Brigham. Okay, he was trying to come up with a more humane way of restraining people who had mania. And this particular crib would not allow a person really to sit up, roll over, move, do self-harm. in the 1870s, they deemed this to be a barbaric form of restraint and banned it, but for many decades, this was considered innovative and the most humane way instead of chaining a person. Okay, so, you know, we got to think about the time period, you know, when we look at things like this and judge it with our modern viewpoints. We got to keep in mind that at the time they were trying to come up with the best ways to restrain and cure and treat people with mental health issues. This particular slide shows the Opal. Has anybody ever heard of the Opal? This was a publication that was created. This was after Brigham had passed away. This was done under Dr. Benedict and then Dr. Gray. This publication ran from 1850 to 1859. And this was written, edited, printed, and sold by the patients within Old Main. And it's very fascinating. I read every single issue that they did. And I was very privileged at the History Center here. They have them in the back, so they're not on display, but they let me go through and read all of them. And that's where I got this artwork from. I scanned it and took pictures of it. The flower picture was actually taken by, drawn by a patient, and you can see that they would actually get advertisements. And the first year in 1850, they made $600 off of this, which is a lot of money back then. And they used that money to buy an oil painting of Dr. Brigham, and they bought a piano for the asylum. But to read this, it's really interesting. You get a lot of fascinating stories and poems and things. But the only thing that is very interesting is obviously the administration scrubbed anything that was controversial, anything that talked about anything but what a great place this is, you know, because, you know, you got to remember this building was built with our taxpayer money at the time at a great expense. So they wanted the public to know that it was nothing but the best of care. But obviously, you know, they had their issues in Old Main. You know, things like the air quality wasn't the best at the time because they didn't have proper ventilation. Heating it was difficult. Right here, this picture is actually a picture of their working farm. When I mentioned occupations, this particular farm was right behind Old Main and sat most of the land where Utica College is now. And they raised all kinds of crops there. They would raise, they had chickens and cows and horses and pigs, and they would use all that to feed the patients within the asylum, but also sell the product from there. And then they would take that money, just like the money from Opal, and they would use it to reinvest back into Old Main programs and different things. So this was part of that moral treatment, working on the farm. Yeah, that first year of the farm, they made $7,401 in 1855. So that's a lot of money back then. Later on in the early 20th century, the state of New York changed it, so all that money had to go to Albany, and then it would be put back into the funds of the Office of Mental Health. But up to that point, all the different things that they did stayed right here in Utica. Now, here is a picture. On the one, you see the men working in the print shop, and back then they would separate. The men and the women were separate in the wings and in their occupations. The only time the men and women would interact with each other would be at church services on Sunday. Reverend Goodrich was the name of the gentleman in the 1850s who was their pastor. So they would do different things, but you can see the print shop there is where they would do the Opal. They would also do the American Journal of Insanity. And then the ladies would do many different sheets and textiles and things like that. And the things that they would sell, they would go to the mechanics fair. They used to have a big fair in Utica at the mechanics hall, and they would make that money. And like I said, they would go right back into what they did. Another interesting thing that they did was they also had the ability to, the higher functioning patients would be able to go on road trips, be able to go places. That particular photo is of the waterfall, that's Trent Falls. which is that it's interesting because I actually purchased that photo online and donated it back to the History Center here, but I now own a home that's right adjacent to this in Prospect, New York. But it was interesting that can you imagine they would take the patients to a place like that? That's not exactly safe when you look at this picture, but you know, they would do things like that to try and help them with their care. And on the other picture you see there that they actually would do things like plays. They would do musicals and plays. And here's a 19th century photo of the patients performing a play on stage at Old Main. And you can see the one photo in this it shows one of their halls decorated for Christmas. There's a Christmas tree and some wreaths and some decorations in there. They used to get a lot of visitors to Old Main, including Governor of the United States. A lot of the legislature would come and visit because it was expensive to run this place. But then I also have another picture showing the crowded hallway. Because what had happened was it swelled with numbers so fast that they couldn't accommodate everybody. So at the time, in the 1850s, they started asking the state of New York to build a facility, especially for the criminally insane, which they ended up building a facility in Auburn, New York. Because like I said earlier, those patients were not safe to be in there with everybody else. And they recognized that that particular population should be on their own somewhere else. This particular slide here shows the School of Nursing, which I even had a few people before this presentation talk to me about that they had loved ones or family members that graduated from there. It was actually very innovative at the time, and it started in, hang on, let me look at my notes.
Sorry, what is it you wanted? Did you want something to eat?
No, I don't want anything to eat. I'm good now. I gotta love this. The nursing school started in 1892 with 59 nurses, and it went until May of 1975, and they had 1,472 graduates. So it was very innovative at the time. It was interesting because they would call Old Main the mother of all institutions, because this was so popular when it opened that very quickly throughout the United States, other facilities like Old Main started to be built in other states and areas, and they would come and learn from Dr. Brigham, Dr. Gray, the patient care, and then they would replicate it back in their locations, especially the moral treatment. It was very innovative. Like I said, this was the first one of its kind in the United States. Now this slide you see here, these are from the 1940s, you know, when patient care started getting a little bit more modern, and you know, things like the Utica crib had been put to rest. They started doing things like the one nurse on the one side is handing out medication. That's where they started learning about things like chemical restraints, you know, different medicines that could help mental illness. And then the other one shows a picture of a doctor and a nurse demonstrating the use of electroshock therapy machine. And that particular picture is from 1949. And they called it electroconvulsive therapy. And at the time, in their annual report, they talked about how they did this treatment on 216 patients in Old Main, with 176 showing improvement. Now, again, we were talking about earlier about, you know, some of the things back then, like lobotomies and electroshock therapy. You consider it now to be just absolutely horrendous, but you know, it's easy for us in our modern age to look back at certain things like that and think, oh, that's just horrible. But think about it. What do doctors do on us today that we consider, you know, regular, that 100 years from now people could say, oh, can you believe that they did that back then? Oh, that people had cancer in 2021 and they would give them radiation. Oh, my goodness. So it's important to look at it that way. And, you know, I think they tried their best. They had proper care and give the best that they could. This particular picture is close to the end when Old Main closed in 1978. And this is just a group of visitors. So as you know, the Old Main has always drawn a huge public interest. When the Landmark Society in the state of New York opened it up a handful of years ago, I think they had at least 3,000 people show up to get a tour. As you may or may not know, it still is open right now, but it's owned by the Office of Mental Health, and they have a records department storage in the first floor. So when they did the tour, all they did was walk you into that area and back out. You could not go down on the wings, you could not go down in the basement, because they were doing a lot of remediation of asbestos, but also some of the building is not in safe condition, so it's not conducive to walk the public through it. This particular photo that I got is an overhead shot of Old Main, and you can see directly behind it, all that land, that's before Utica College existed on this property. So you can see how old it is now. Right behind it is, I believe, one of the Proctor Junior Highs is back there, and then now, thank you, Donovan. I knew that. I had a little bit of, but yes, Donovan is behind there, and then also Utica College. So some interesting facts about Old Main. Like I said, it was the first asylum in New York State and the largest in the USA. It was the second asylum, but like I said, it was the first one that had moral treatment, and the patient care was totally, totally different. And the second is an interesting fact that in the 1850s, it was one of the biggest tourist destinations in the United States. 2,700 visitors a year, which was astounding. And back then, they would actually allow the public to come in and walk through and see the patients because it was important to show how the care was being conducted. But then really quickly, they realized that this was almost, I don't want to use the term exploitation, but it made the patients feel self-conscious and they didn't like it, people coming in and gawking at them. So they ended it. Then it was only people that were of a medical background or politicians that from the state that helped. They wanted to see what the money was going into. And I use this term rain bath because in the late 19th century, really we call it a shower that we have today, but back then they called it a rain bath. So I like that terminology. It was the first to have steam heat. Like I mentioned, that was a big improvement. In the wintertime, it's a big old cold building, so instead of using wood and coal. The Great Fire is very fascinating to me because a couple people lost their lives in this. And it was in 1855, a man by the name of William Spears set Old Main on fire. It's very interesting to read the old newspaper articles from that time because he had been an arsonist in New York City, and they put him up in Old Main saying, well, we can cure him. So when he was deemed cured, okay, they decided that he was such a great guy that they were going to give him a job. So he was a maintenance man, and he had keys to all the buildings and everything else. And he decided one day that he was going to set a fire up in the attic. So he set a fire in the attic, and luckily the place was saved due to what they did was they evacuated all the patients. It was in July of 1855, July of 1855. They evacuated all the patients out of there, and then they had fire departments from all over come, and they had to carry buckets of water and pump water up from the Erie Canal to try to put it out. It was in the center part of Old Main, and they were able to get out a lot of the furnishings and things like that. And none of the patients died in that fire, but there was one nurse, or actually a doctor. Dr. Rose was his name. He died in the fire. And one firefighter, I'll give you his name, William Sesford, died. He was a Utica firefighter who died in that. So they had 2 deaths from it. At first, they didn't realize that it was William Spears that set it until a week later, he got caught running away from one of their barns, a building on the outside of Old Main that was on fire. So that's when they realized, okay, he had a past history as a firebug. And this whole thing caused a huge controversy where some of the New York City newspapers were criticizing the patient care and saying, how could you do this? He ended up costing lives. But they weathered that storm. Dr. Gray was a very brilliant man, and he weathered that storm. But, they trusted the wrong guy with the keys to the building, But he ended up being recommitted, but not in Old Main. They moved him downstate. And then I mentioned the American Journal of Insanity being printed there. And like I said, it's still printed to this day as the American Journal of Psychiatry, I believe it's called. Yeah, to this day. And then I mentioned Opal. And then yes, again, mother of all asylums, because so much intellectual capital came out of there, the doctors and the patient care, and influenced patient care throughout the whole United States. Now, I got a couple of, Utica Public Library has, if anybody ever wants to go and look at them, you have to ask. They have the old annual reports, not throughout the whole history, but this one was from 1855, but they got a bunch of them. They're reference books, you gotta keep them there, but they're so fascinating. I read through all of them. So this particular slide, can you all see it okay? No, probably not, but this one page in the report actually had the forms of insanity that deemed people to be admitted into Old Main. And you'll see the number one thing that people got admitted for was dementia, which was 92 total patients admitted in 1855 from old age and dementia. And I just look at some of these and I don't even know what some of them mean, but I find it very interesting that when they say feigned insanity, that was one man who pretended to be insane and was admitted, one person. But then I look at one and you can see there's 5, it says drunkards. So people that were alcoholics, I guess. And I found it interesting, I don't know why, that it's 5 men but none of the women. But these kinds of things fascinate me. This particular picture I took from the 1855 annual report.
What is this?
I know, we can hear you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We're gonna
mute your microphone, that's okay. Well, this particular slide, I'm going to read you a little quote from it because I've had many people say that when they worked there in the 60s or 70s that they used to have chains in there, okay? I cannot confirm that because when you write a book like this, what you have to go on is facts, not opinion. And, from at least in the early days, Dr. Brigham and the state of New York, they were very, very anti-chains. No chains allowed. That's where they came up with the Utica crib. And many times they would talk about how patients would arrive to the facility in chains and they would unchain them. They would not allow them to walk into the place with chains on. They would do it out in front of the steps. And this particular write-up, it's interesting. It's about a man who showed up and he had been in chains so long they couldn't unbolt them. They were rusted to the man, rusted shut. So they actually had to use saws to cut him loose before they brought him into Old Main. He said he was confined in iron handcuffs and footlocks. And he had been chained to a floor for 6 months before coming to Old Main. So I read this kind of stuff in many of the old reports. I'm not saying that they never chained people. I don't know. But like I said, when you write a book like this, you have to go on the facts that you collect. And I'm not saying that this is the comprehensive, complete history. It's just the best that I could do with the limited resources that were available. This particular page I also found fascinating. This is the 1856 annual report, where this is where they really were saying that the criminally insane that they were admitting in Old Main were a huge danger to the other patients and even the staff. They said they had 22 committed to Old Main that committed murder. And 14 guilty of arson, of course, which one of them was the gentleman who set the place on fire and killed 2 people. So they did a lot of lobbying back then to build additional facilities because, like I said, as big as Old Main was, it filled up fast. Now, okay, what this is it's a 1920 silent movie that they shot right here in Utica at Old Main. And my best guess was, if you watch this, it looks to me like it was a film that was shot in order to lobby the state of New York for more money. Because at the end of the 3rd clip, they show the crowded hallways. I think what they want, I guess we could use the term propaganda. This particular film shows a woman who's being admitted because she's having postpartum depression, okay? And then they place her in Old Main and they show all the wonderful patient care and all the wonderful things they do for her. And then they release her at the end, but at the very end of the third clip, like I said, they show massive overcrowding. And at the time, this was when they started building Marcy. And what they did was they transferred people from Old Main and Utica over to Marcy. I'd like to play this for you because it's very hard to find and it's rare for people to see this. So they called it Out of the Shadows. So, can you see this? I'll step out of the way. Can't read it? Yeah, I'm trying to, how do I click this off?